My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs by Slice, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. Hi there, and welcome to a Safety Labs by Slice special, where we investigate the complex idea of safety culture. Everyone talks about safety culture, but they rarely agree on its definition. Many of the guests on our show have questioned if it even exists. Is it something that an organization is or does? Can it be analyzed, measured, or managed? And is it any different from the wider organizational culture? We've compiled a collection of thoughts, opinions, and ideas about safety culture from some of our previous guests. We hope you enjoy hearing experienced HSE professionals, consultants, authors, and academics share their views on the many facets of safety culture. And most of all, we hope that hearing these different perspectives helps you to come to your own conclusions about safety culture and what it means for your practice. Let's start with the confusion and move towards clarity. The chapter I referred to was a literature survey of safety research that highlighted the intersecting, inconsistent, and poorly defined use of the term safety culture across a number of research papers. Why do you think that this confusion exists, and why is it important to address?
Yeah, great question. I think the confusion is because the original mainstream definition of safety culture, which emerged following the Chernobyl incident, was really a catch-all phrase. It sort of included behaviors, beliefs, attitudes, values, priorities. It was just a very broad term. And so I think from that early beginning, everything that's been done since has either tried to narrowly, try and get through that ambiguity and sort of cloudy murkiness of what the definition is, they're sort of that direction, or they've just run with that definition and perpetuated some of that murkiness. It's important to clarify because otherwise we don't have consistency in measurement. We have different concepts of the same, what we call a construct, sort of an imaginary sort of intangible thing that in psychology we try to measure. And so that means that we don't really get progress. If we start to measure things, measure a concept using different types of measures, then it's very difficult to move the field forward because everyone has a different view on how to operationalize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's apples and oranges, as they say.
Yeah, definitely.
Safety is about trust, right? Nobody cares what you know out there. They want to know that you care about them. And that's not something we teach from a formal standpoint. We talk about it all the time. I mean, it's easy to say safety culture, which I despise that term, by the way. There's no safety culture. If you want to bring on another guest, and I'll debate them that there is no such thing as a safety culture. There's only a culture within your organization, right? And this is kind of part of that. So I'm gonna go on a little bit of rant, and I'm gonna come back to your question. You cool with that?
All right.
All right.
But yeah.
Safety culture, when you say that, it's like it sits over here by itself. And then you have an accounting culture, and then you have an operations culture, and then you got an office culture, and then you got some other culture for the dudes in the warehouse. You know, it's your company's culture. And the sooner we understand that, the better it is, because safety and your overall company culture are the same thing. So if we start, you got to correct the language, right? If we say safety culture, we're implying that it's something that's separate and apart from our other culture. It's just a culture of your organization. So how do I establish good culture? Well, the first thing is I got to establish relationships. I got to be, are these soft skills really soft skills, or are they not the most important skills? Because I can go to this book. And I can figure out what the regulation is. And now I can Google the regulation and I can find out what we're supposed to be doing. But if you want to implement that, you got to have a relationship. You can't. One of my favorite memes is this meme of a safety professional going out on a job and says, I don't know how to do your job, but my book says you're doing it wrong. That is not the way to develop a good relationship. So I think we could have better training in conferences and maybe in some of the formal education that we do from people that say, I went into a tough situation and this is what I did. You know, people act like culture is changed overnight. I came in, I got a new set of policies and procedures. Why aren't these people following it? So your point, Mary, that these are core skills is a major one. If there's any one thing that we could improve on, is that, because we can learn the regulations, but if we can't get people to do it and we can't apply it, what good are they?
Consider your definition of what you think safety is, because you've got two little words there, safety and culture. We're kind of, I think, today agreed on what culture is, that it's comprised of beliefs and assumptions, values, priorities, and behaviors that are all together in one mix. But the safety part we haven't really unpacked today. And safety can be, everyone can have different models of how safety happens. They can be, the definition of safety might be about procedures and compliance. It might be about adaptation and resilience. It might be about leadership and culture and, these more capability type aspects of how we build safety or create it. So if we sort of say this loose term safety culture, but don't stop and think, well, what do I actually consider safety to be, and what does good safety look like? What's sort of my template that I'm judging this culture by? Again, we just miss an opportunity to clarify and get a shared understanding with who we're trying to communicate with, because they may have a very different concept of safety. So if you say, well, the safety culture is great, it's good, but you're operating from that kind of proceduralized and compliance perspective, that other person might say, well, it doesn't look good to me. People are just following the rules and not using their brains. When there's an unexpected surprise, they don't deviate or improvise. They just do what they're told. So that's, again, an opportunity to just have a conversation and really define clearly where you're coming from.
What other issues do you see as currently problematic or at least needing improvement in the world of OHS? I know that you speak about diversity for one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I talk about diversity, I talk about intersectionality, and a bunch of different topics that come up when you're talking about how to work with somebody, okay? And when I say how to work with somebody, everybody comes to the workplace layered with all these different things, right? They have their ethnicity, they have how they think, which it brings in the neurodiversity. They have maybe the family group that they come to, they bring their issues. And so I like to talk about, are we dealing with the person on the person level, right? While you're thinking about that culture, right? Because, I don't know how many people have probably come on your program and talked about culture, right? Safety culture. And I'm kind of like, there is no such thing as safety culture. There's culture, and it's made up of who you have at the time, at the point of task, right? So you and I might be doing a task with 2 or 3 other people, and that's the group, that's the culture that matters right there at, whatever hazardous thing that we're doing. And so what you bring, what I bring, how I think, how you think, how the people who are with us think, it all matters in doing something safely. So, there's tendency, at least recently, for people to go to those theories and treat everybody as if they're the same, right? We all come from Oklahoma, or we all come from New Hampshire, or we all come from a construction background. But that's not enough. It's not enough to treat people as some broad group, even if it's the same company and we all have the same orientation. It's not enough to bring people in and treat them as if we're going to be some kind of homogeneous mixture that we can just put at a task and get things done the right way or the safe way or those types of things. So that's a big issue.
To quote the famous statistician George Box, he once said, let me think of the quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think most sort of safety culture development tools would fall into that category, including the one I'm using. And the one I've been using now for many years effectively is Professor Patrick Hudson's model of cultural maturity. But that's 20 odd years old now. And why I think it's useful still is because when I work with organizations, I believe in meeting people where they are. My own preference is not really to talk about safety culture, because I don't think that's really a thing, even though I just wrote a book about it, right? In other words, I certainly believe in culture, and I believe if you've got a maturing culture, well, safety culture would sit as a function of that, if you like. With Hudson's model, I always found it useful for organizations, many of whom use that anyway, so let me meet them where they are. It was useful for helping them to work out where they currently sit. to some degree. And I think that is useful. If we can get a bit of an idea about where we currently sit, possibly even with regard to where other similar organizations or similar industries sit, that can be useful. More to the point, if we know where we currently are, that can help us to really work out quite clearly what we need to do to progress, what we need to do. And so I found it really useful. Hudson's model, again, that 20-something years old, it didn't include many of the things that we do now work with clients. Things like psychological safety, for example, was not part of that original model. Other aspects, Hudson's original model had those 5 stages drawn as very discrete entities. That is, you're either in one of those boxes or you're not. And so in my experience, it's not actually like that. There might be elements of the organization that they straddle maybe a few of those different areas. And so for me, it was, I just made some tweaks to that model. I drew it as not just 5 discrete boxes, but as a journey, because we can go backwards too, and we might come to that. And so there was other things like trust. Trust was part of Hudson's model. He did concede that increasing levels of trust tended to be associated with more mature organizations, but he didn't really sort of go into any depth on that, whereas for me, it's absolutely core. So there were a few things like that. So I made a few changes for the book. And so similarly, though, to Patrick Hudson, those apathetic, let's start with that, really in those cultures, safety is just it's something we've got to do, right? The damn regulators make us do that. There's no great wish to have it there. It's like, we work in a dangerous company, incidents happen, and there's a resignation to that. It's really about avoiding punishment. So managers avoiding punishment from the regulators, for example. For the workforce, it's more about avoiding punishment from the managers and so forth. So it's based purely on putting the tick in the box, avoiding trouble, staying out of trouble. Now, unfortunately, first up, quite naturally, they hurt way more people, particularly really serious injuries. But there's a lot of fear amongst the workforce because incidents are generally seen purely as the fault of the workers. They are stupid. I've heard that said. They are stupid. They don't follow procedure. They don't speak up. They take shortcuts. So intrinsically there, it's about blaming the workforce. Now, where you have blame, high levels of blame, you have high levels of fear and wishing to avoid punishment. So secrets are kept from management. There's us versus them, and secrets are kept. As I also wrote in the book, we can't fix a secret. We certainly can't fix. So apathetic looks like that. Now, reactive, safety is a priority. So we've moved a bit there. The trouble is it's often more of a priority after an incident. That's when we get the action, right? And still, it tends to come back to the workforce. They might start employing some BBS tools and things like that, where effectively it's still blame-based safety, BBS sort of thing. So we still tend to blame the workers. If we progress, involving then, and as the name suggests, now we've made a bit of a shift. We're now bringing our people in. We understand they can contribute. In fact, their contribution as we mature becomes more and more valuable. We realize they are effectively the experts in the jobs that they do. They understand the nuances of the work, where the new policy fits perfectly, and sometimes where they have to adapt it just to get the job done. And there's that realization that if we bring them in, if we involve the workforce, then our systems work better, our procedures work better. And just quietly, of course, as we bring in the workforce, what we're also increasing our levels of trust. So fear starts to drop and trust starts to come up. Now, when my whole team starts to feel that level of trust, that's what we would refer to as that psychological safety. So we're starting that process of involving. Now, proactive, of course, that has just become just what we do. We see that incidents happen because of a whole range of variables, including leadership decisions, including management decisions. The workforce then are fully involved in safety right across the board. Ultimately, we get to what we call the integrated, and it's integrated because safety is now not a separate thing. We don't view safety as this separate entity. It's just how we do work. And for me, I love to hear this. The level 5 industries tend to not even talk about safety very much. whereas in the lower realm, it's safety. So we create this whole separate world about safety. We have the safety team who hold the workforce to account, and so forth. Level 5, that's rare. We just don't. We talk about doing work well and reliably with the full and welcome collaboration from the workforce. Trust is very high. Fear of speaking up, fear of admitting mistake is essentially gone. The us versus them is largely replaced by we. And of course, because of that, because we've got the full involvement of the workforce, we tend to identify more risks, more hazards very proactively. If we do that, we can manage and mitigate more risks. And of course, naturally, this flows to, they tend to have way less than their fair share of incidents, especially the serious ones. So that's roughly the progression. Now, for me, the things that stand out the most there, as we mature, we increasingly bring the workforce in. We listen to them. We respond to them. People that are now involved. And the other big thing for me, of course, is the ongoing elevating aspects of trust and psychological safety. So that's, in a very nutshell version, Mary, the progression as I see it.
As far as predominant different meanings of safety culture, you've talked about safety culture understood as a mirror, a measure, or a map. Can you walk me through what those perspectives mean?
Yeah, definitely. So the challenge we have is because those definitions of safety culture are so broad and they're so established, we can't necessarily just wipe the slate clean and start fresh. So it's helpful to use little analogies or a metaphor more precisely to try and convey the meaning of what perspective we're taking on the safety culture. So a mirror, the first analogy or metaphor is really about holding up a mirror to show the organization in a deep way, to encourage it to reflect on the way it thinks, the way the assumptions, the beliefs, the very deep core aspects of what we might call a descriptive approach to the organizational culture. The second approach, which is the measure, is a little more tangible and really feeds into another branch of culture research, which refers to safety climate, more of a tangible, kind of quantifiable part of safety culture, which refers to the priority of safety as inferred from perceptions of policies and procedures and practices in the organization. So that the measure is more like if we were to take out a tape measure and assess something, that's what we would do. And the last one, the map, is really about maturity models and this more pragmatic, practitioner-oriented approach to safety culture. So charting a landscape of different levels of maturity, showing the organization the future of where it could potentially go, helping it on its journey to improvement. Now, I think, with all that in mind, one of the things to consider with safety culture is I consider it as a perspective or a point of view on which to look at the broader organizational culture. There's a lot of criticism to say we should do away with this term called safety culture because it's too confusing. It takes away attention from the broader issues in the organization and really narrowly defines things. But I would argue that, implicitly, we're always evaluating our cultures. We're always looking at it from a point of view. And if we make that safety part tangible and define it and discuss it and say to each other, well, this is what I think safety means to me, that at least surfaces that bias and allows us to move forward with a common understanding of what safety and culture mean together.
So instead of getting rid of the term, just using it to foster this kind of discussion, which will kind of unearth what's behind it. And it sort of sounds like what you're saying is everyone has projected their own meaning depending on where they're coming from, what's going on in their heads.
I think that's true. And I don't dismiss the concerns that if we do focus on organizational culture rather than safety culture, we're going to have a broader perspective of what's going on in the workplace. We might otherwise miss things that could be important for safety. So, for example, our HR practices or the way that people think about performance management and appraisal, that would play a role in shaping the culture. But if we narrowly define it as a safety culture, sometimes we can miss that. I think, though, it's sort of a little play on words. We're still talking about the broader organizational culture, but we're saying, how do these things, these artifacts, these beliefs, these manifestations shape the way safety is practiced? So it's still that broad approach, but we're just focusing on how does this affect the safety performance or management techniques in the organization.
Let's talk about leadership styles, and then I'm curious if anything has changed in your view of the reflective evidence-based approach.
Yeah, sure. So the leadership styles comes to what I was talking about before about as the safety professional role gets separated from the organization, we start to use structural approaches to leadership. We lead by managing, and we manage by implementing systems. And that's only one style of leadership. I'm not a big fan of the way ideas like culture have been corrupted in safety. But there is an essential point here, which is that you can influence other people by ways other than making them do a form. You can influence them by symbolic gestures and by motivation and by the work climate and by your relationships with them. You can influence other people by sitting down with them and listening to them rather than making them fill out a form. And they're more likely to go away and do what you want because you listen to them talk about their kids for half an hour than because you made them do a risk assessment. And I think in safety, as our role has become separated, we've become more reluctant to use those other tools of leadership. And I think just more active reflection on our role as leaders rather than our role as safety managers would really benefit some safety practice in some organizations.
There's a million elements of culture, values, principles, artifacts, God knows what. But, you find when you're trying to explain things, you don't want to have anything more than three, everything should be down in threes. And I think the three clusters of issues are number one, your systems, your procedures, your rules, your training, all that good, your safety management system, your risk assessments, all the stuff that we go and audit and invest in. And obviously, if you haven't hit diminishing returns with that, there's work to be done. Go and buy some safety equipment, have a safety professional who knows what a good safety management system looks like. Get your ISOs. But what you find, of course, is a lot of organizations get from not very good to compliant with their systems. And then they think, well, look, we've got this far with our systems. What we need are more systems and more rules. And, everybody listening to this will have worked in an organization where the rules just proliferated until they actually started getting in the way, and diminishing returns is hit. And the workers are saying, oh, no, not more bloody paperwork and so on. A lot of organizations call it the blob effect. You just keep piling into it and it just gets bigger and bigger. And so once you've hit diminishing returns, you really need to address something smarter, like turn left and focus on the human factor. And we think there are two elements of that. The first one is good old-fashioned empowerment and engagement. To what extent are your workers heads up and switched on? And this, of course, is a factor of transformational leadership rather than transactional leadership, by which I mean that they're coached rather than told. They're praised rather than criticised. The communications are excellent and clear. So at this point, really good posters and really clear paint become useful. Toolbox talks that are full of dialogue become useful. Anything that generally, gets and of course the classic one that we're seeing in Britain at the moment, you lead by example, because we're all leading by example at all times, whether we want to be or not. So it's a good idea to be doing it well. Otherwise, people get awfully upset and demotivated and angry, and think that things are unfair, and that's the last thing you want. Unfairness is the most deadly of all the sort of psychosocial issues there are, because it completely undermines trust, and trust is key. So you want all that going on, and you got your switched on motivated workers, and what you want them doing ideally is learning. And HSG 48 shows really clearly that when you step back objectively, what you see is that about 80% of what's going wrong out there is structural. It's unintentional mistakes caused by fatigue, lack of training, lack of tools, lack of time, or it's the cultural stuff. We've made a start on the cultural stuff. A lot of the cultural stuff is not people just doing what they want to do. It's doing what they think the organization wants for them, or the best they can. So you hear things like, you could have it quick, you could have it cheap, you could have it good quality. Pick any two. And if you cascade that sort of issue down to the workforce, they'll just do the best they can and they'll second guess you. So hardly ever, when you step back and look at it, is it just an individual off on a folly of their own, and even when it is an individual off on a folly of their own, there were questions to be asked. Who employed this person? Who trained this person? Who's supervising this person? Who's responsible for sending them out there so demotivated and half-cocked? You know, you can't just blame the individual because they've done something daft. And, you know, an ABC analysis temptation analysis shows really clearly if the safe way is slow, inconvenient, or uncomfortable, then, you know, it's highly tempting to find a workaround and crack on. You know, not everybody will. Some people have got great self-control and so on, but most of us haven't. And it's just a head count of how many people do cut that corner, and risk mounts up and people get hurt. And of course, if it's something that looks a bit daft at a glance, it's really easy to blame people then and say, well, you cut the corner, you knew what you were doing. You know, but yes, but I was really tired. I was getting towards at the end of a long shift. I'm absolutely desperate for a cup of coffee. And I just couldn't resist that little corner cut just to try and have 10 minutes to regain my breath. So when you step back, there's so much you can learn. And of course, the classic one is, instead of shouting, why have you done that? You ask the question, why did you do that? Because 9 times out of 10, curious why has got a good answer. And so the final of the 3 pieces for me is learning. I think Carol Dweck, she's from your neck of the woods, I think, you know, who wrote the best-selling book Mindset. Sold 3 million copies or whatever. And the essence of that book is that she says her best ever boss asked 3 questions. What's going wrong? Why is it going wrong? What are we going to do about it? You know, and then if you cross-reference that to somebody like Andrew Hopkins, the Australian writer, who wrote some fabulous books like Failure to Learn and Disastrous Decisions, you know, and his mindful safety concept, which his mindful safety concept is, look, yeah, any complex organization is chock full of risk and mistakes every day. Now, you know, the weaker organizations wait for those mistakes to blow up into something that finds us. The better organizations proactively go out there and try and find what's going wrong, you know, as quickly and as proactively as possible.
So in your book, you said that traditionally safety is about the business of managing failure.
Yes.
And what you are trying to push it towards is the business of gaining process stability.
That's right. They're very perceptive. Yep. That is, so inside that envelope of building stability and being rewarded with all of the things that our business needs, that's where the culture comes in. And I do say often when I speak on this that I think that our profession has a fatal flaw in it. We've taught generations of managers to manage failure. It's like slapping them on the hands and saying, don't touch that. And really what it leads to is also a culture of managing failure. And we don't learn the skills in our profession to build an organization that maybe doesn't manage failure, but doesn't tolerate error or doesn't tolerate variation in process controls, who looks at the safety profession in its own lane and somehow looks and decides that lane can somehow provide enough gravity to pull all of the excellence we need in and around it. And it simply isn't true. Safety is just is an input. It is an outcome. And looking at it as an outcome of looking at process and process capability and process state stability as the objective, it changes the way we look at how we do our hazard assessments, how we engage our people, how we engage our leadership. I'm not discounting all the very important things we do around compliance and training, and none of that gets lost in this discussion. But how do I generate a culture that values stability and is willing to not value error in a way that they're willing to fix process incrementally every day? And there's some things we'll talk about around that, and there's some things I think that add to or enhance our ability and capability of being effective and improving those processes. And error creates variation in our process. And just go through really quickly. That variation, as it continues through our process, creates unpredictability when operators get to it. One time I have to shave it, one time I have to saw it. I have to do changes to it to make it sellable. It's no longer first run, first quality. And if enough of those craftsmanshiping things inside of our processes happen over time, then we're paying people to fix error. But if anything happens in that first dynamic inside the factory from error to variation, the first domino that always falls is quality. Quality follows first. And then as it continues on our process, depending on the types of errors that get added to that process, then the safety domino falls. It always falls after quality.
And if it continues on through the process, I've got people doing craftsmanship, fixing quality. Now I'm paying people to fix error, and my efficiency falls off. And that's the process that happens in many of our, whether I'm talking about manufacturing, an office environment, we end up paying people to fix error. But in manufacturing environment specifically, that error could lead to injuries. So people ask me, Chris, how do you get to zero harm? Well, I've got to fix quality. I have to fix error and variation in my processes. And that is this magic on how I've always been able to do these conversions, because I understand by shrinking the magnitude of the error and lengthening the frequency between errors, I'm sure also shrinking the magnitude of potential safety and harm and the length between harm. And the better I get at it, the less the changes in having more incremental and compounding effects positive to the culture that I want, which is one that doesn't tolerate error and values process. I'd like to stop here because I think I'm probably uncoupling a little bit from our EHS managers, and they're thinking, well, what about safety committees, and what about JHAs and all of the things that we do? That is infrastructure inside of our profession that we have to maintain and sustain. None of this takes away from that, but focusing the organization differently in a way where they want to go anyway only enhances our capability of being effective. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're in a production environment, my job is to get the production out, the quality, the time, and the planned rate that we have to. Otherwise, we don't make money. Nobody eats. So anything that makes that process improve is certainly something they're going to be engaged in. If I add at the end of your day, the 30 things I need you to do for safety is adjunct or bolt-on activities to that, well, I may not get to that today. I'm so busy running my things. So how do I ingrain my processes and align my priorities with theirs? There's something funny about safety, and I've been doing this a long time, as I said. I can't tell you how much safety weighs. I don't know what it eats. I couldn't tell you what it looks like in the wild. I don't know if it's tameable. What I'm saying is safety is kind of a nebulous concept to rally an organization around. If I lined 100 people up and asked them what's safety, I'd get 100 different answers because it really isn't it's very intangible. It's kind of like pretty. I mean, everybody has a definition of pretty, right? My mom says I'm pretty.
Well, moms are always right.
Well, yeah, they're supposed to do that. But those are the things that really are difficult, because when we talk about rallying around safety and zero harm, safety culture, it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, and everybody doesn't have the same level of focus around that objective. But if I rally around error and process controls, and I can put together things in safety that helps enhance those processes, and I get you into continuous improvement to make processes better, and I make things 10% better, 15% better everywhere we're going to continuous improvement. Do that 10,000 times in small incremental improvements next year, and you'll wake up with a different company at the end of the year.
It's a temptation, I think, to sort of say, look, safety culture is comprised of everything from beliefs and assumptions, sort of these fundamental, ways of how the world works in our heads, all the way up to documentation, behaviors, things that we might see, signs and symbols in the organization. The problem with those more tangible aspects of culture, which Edgar Schein talks about, is, they can be interpreted multiple different ways. We could look on the wall and see a poster that says something about, behavioral-based safety or stop and think or something like that. But is that really reflective of the broader culture? It could just be something that was put there, by an individual, but doesn't necessarily represent the broader sharedness of those perceptions and beliefs in the organization. So we have to be careful over interpreting the artifacts or the tangible signs of safety culture. We have to do so in conjunction with some of those deeper, more meaningful units of meaning in the organization.
All right, so we'll go through. The first one is, I'm quoting here, a work environment characterized by the shared values of trust, honesty, and fairness.
So that's organizational culture.
Okay.
Right? Is the factor. And, from a health and safety perspective, you might think, well, I can't do anything about that, right? That's the culture. But culture really comes down to the way that we feel about the way we're treated, in the workplace. That's why honesty and trust is so important. So as a health and safety professional, you could be asking people on the ground floor, what is your experience? What would it take for you to trust that this organization had your back, had your best interests balanced with the interests of the organization? They can ask that and get an honest answer, and they can turn around and say to the employer, like they would with other hazards, here's some ways we think that you can mitigate this risk and improve it. And it's as simple as that you are getting information that maybe the employer can't get through a survey, that maybe they can't get it through interviews, but people will be honest with you because of your position. And you know that if you can change the way people feel about the organization, you're going to change the way they work. You're going to improve that idea of a safety culture where we all have each other's backs.
How does a safety professional go about fostering a psychologically safe workplace? It's kind of an abstract.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question because, we do rely on our safety professionals to help any organization set up the right culture. And by that, I mean, set up the right behaviors, right? I mean, if you look at the definition of culture, it's all about the behaviors we use in any organization. It's how we grow up together and how we influence one another to behave in certain ways. That's really culture in a simple definition. And we rely on the safety professionals to foster an environment that provides safe behaviors going forward. So I think one of the biggest things they can do right off the bat is show a tremendous amount of gratitude for when workers come to them and want to stop work, right? Show a tremendous amount of gratitude and appreciation, recognition, however they do it, when people do stop work and they have questions because they're trying not to proceed in the face of uncertainty. So safety professionals could certainly reinforce that positive behavior through gratitude, recognition, reward, those type of things. I think also that once a worker has been brave enough to do something, raise a concern, stop work or whatever, it's imperative that the safety professional follow up with them to let them know how these things were resolved or handled, or what we need to do for next steps before we proceed. They start collaborating, working with them, or if it's just a concern they had, make sure we follow up with them to let them know how things were handled.
Where would you focus soft skills training? In your case, I think I would say maybe psychological skills training for tomorrow's safety professionals. What skills do you think would be most helpful to them?
I think if they don't have a background in psychology, their undergrad degree or whatever, then I think one way or the other, be it formal workshops or just watching a whole bunch of videos on YouTube or doing short courses, things like that, really getting up to speed on this whole idea of psychological health in the workplace and how it fits in with what they may have been focusing more on in terms of physical hazards. And I think and again, this is extending what they're probably already into in terms of moving just from that reaction and compliance mindset to more of a safety culture approach and extending what you've been doing there into having a culture of psychological health and safety. It might be bringing in someone who is a psychologist, either as a consultant or as someone in the organisation to look after that aspect. And again, often it's really hard if you're 45 to go all the way back and become a fully registered licensed psychologist. So often what really works there is a bit of education yourself, but part of that education is often working with people who are already there to bring in a qualified psychologist and to work and partner with them. And so that you get that level of expertise within the organisation very quickly, but also you are learning by doing. The 70-20-10 rule. You can do some reading, you can partner with people, but most of it is the 70% of it, developing ourselves is really about learning by doing, experiential learning. So getting involved and partnering with people who are subject matter experts in this area, and they will learn from you about safety culture and the organisation itself, and where are all the roadblocks and who's helpful and all that sort of business. And you'll be learning from them and working with them and the management in order to create this environment. So it's more culture, because it needs to be systems and practices and things and policies and investment. So creating this environment of promoting positive psychological health, well-being, and productivity in the workplace.
I'm definitely a big believer in listening to the language that people are using. That you'll get an indicator very, very quickly about the culture of an organisation just by the way that people talk. You know, if you start to hear blame and punishment sort of language, and or else, and right away I will go in and sort of change that and challenge it. I will start talking about learning. I'll start talking about improving, innovation. And then, why did that make sense for them to do that? Rather than, and that's uncomfortable as well. Maybe, like I've been challenged a number of times with people going, nah, he's just an idiot. Nah, he's just lit. So you just have to be dogged. You just have to be true to your values and just keep going for it. It will be challenging, but it will be worth it in the end, trust me.
What about male trades workers? We're mostly talking about trades, but of course there's PPE and workwear for all kinds of different industries. But do the male workers have a role in the solution of this problem?
Allyship, being an ally and accepting women into the trades. And I think there's a healthy amount of that. I know anywhere I've gone, from the male workers in the field, I've never really experienced a problem, only maybe a handful of times. So having male allies that can speak up for you when you don't feel comfortable, that can be there to partner with you, not doing the white knight thing, but being proactive and saying, hey, I got you, and I want to make sure you feel comfortable and inclusive within our safety culture, within our work culture. What do you need from me to be safe while you're working? And when they come across the comments of, well, that's what it is, or the misogynistic comments even, that they're standing up and saying something, because we're changing at such a rapid pace that I think there's this little bit of old school mentality still out there that needs to just be shattered. Women want to come to work. They want to do a job just like a guy does. And we want to get paid the same as well, which is, part of the reason why women go into trades.
Ultimately, this is why the workplace and every place ends up being unsafe for some people, because we just really didn't think about it. And you mentioned earlier about how do you get this sense of safety, depending on who's in the room. The question is, who is it that we say we are trying to help? So you're an organization, you hired X number of people, 10 people, 10,000 people, doesn't matter. If you hired these people or you brought people into your organization, they should have a voice, particularly should have a voice in how safe environment is created, how the safety policies are written, how they should have a voice in that, not this classic command and control kind of leadership that says, I'm the CEO or the safety director, and I will tell everybody what to do. That doesn't work. It really never did, but it works even less now that you have people. I have more information in my phone than NASA had when they put folks on the moon. That's just the way. And we now have Generation Z and millennials who are digital natives who can get this information in seconds. They don't need you to tell them it's this way or that. They need to tell you what we're trying to accomplish, not how to do it. Most of the time, a lot of it, they can figure it out. They can go watch it on YouTube and learn better than you, who doesn't really know much about it, but that's the way we do it here at our company or our organization. So what I'm saying is having this culture of openness and inclusivity in everything that we do that says so OSHA requires us to have a policy on this, but what that policy looks like for us should be the product of all of our input. Now, again, I'm not naive enough to believe that every single person will be able to contribute, but every interest group, and we should give everyone the opportunity to say, that part doesn't work for me. And if it doesn't, let's make the adjustment, because ultimately the goal is to cause them or help them feel safe. That's what it's about.
So yeah, it's going to be different. It's going to be different. And I say this so often, I heard someone else say it and I continue to repeat it. Different does not mean deficient. It simply means different. And when we're having conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion, I find those sometimes almost exhausting because they're slogans. Because as soon as someone sees it different, all heads of the room turn to that person and, well, how could you think that? Well, because I do. I don't need a reason to think that way. I just do. I don't feel safe. Well, why not? What's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with me. If there's wrong, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the system either, but it just doesn't cause me to feel safe when it goes that way. That's all. Let's not make this something that it's not. Let's not make it accusatory. That's not the point. The question is, does the person exposed to that environment feel safe or not? And if they don't, what is it going to take to get them there? Because again, as soon as we bring them in to the family, to the organization, we have a responsibility. If we didn't want that responsibility, we shouldn't have hired them in the first place.
And second stories, for those who don't know, first story is where something happens, an accident happens, an incident happens, and you get this stuff that's happened. You get the narrative straight away, the time, the people, the immediate cause about what happened. There's often a lot of blame. There's a lot about focus on individuals. The second story comes out slower. It takes curious questions to understand what's going on. It requires a just culture so that people can talk about, you know what, these are the trade-offs that I have to do all the time to get this job. But why haven't we had the accidents before? Because I'm managing that capacity and managing those uncertainties and getting it done. And for whatever reason, something tipped the balance and I lost control of the capacity and we had an accident. It's about understanding how busy management are, because often it's this bit of safety culture, poor leadership, that's it. When you go actually find out how busy the leadership is and how busy the management are and the goals that they've got to manage, and instead of going through, this expectation, here's a document sent. You need to review all of this as part of the sort of the process, the validation process, make sure it's okay, the auditing process, before it's sent out there. And then you find out that actually they only got 20 minutes to review it because they had a whole bunch of other big KPIs, which their boss has said, that's the most important thing. And they know that document set has to go out because there's a project coming in and they've got to execute it because there's money associated with it. So it's going up and out, not down and in, to find out what's going on.
We are in a world right now where I want to say safety has matured and a lot of organizations are becoming more sophisticated and it's truly about process and all that, but it's truly about I believe a leadership commitment and how you're leading your people. And so if the leader is coming from a space or a place where something is more important than the person, however they still say that the person is the most important thing, then there's gonna be a ripple effect. So authenticity is extremely important, at least from at a minimum, which is a big ask, is to have the leaders of the organization in all different levels coming from a place that there is a genuine, authentic concern for the people of the organization, and then from there you can, safety is kind of like a byproduct of creating a nice, a good, safe environment. And when I say safe environment, I don't mean like making sure everyone has their proper PPE and all that, but like creating a safe environment, like kind of a psychosocial safe environment where folks feel free to bring up concerns, free of reprisal and things of that nature. But again, without an authentic leadership design or without authentic leaders, you'll never get there.
Workplace culture plays a big role in your thinking. And you've spoken about potentially unconscious cues that show cultural priorities that influence people's behavior. So can you give an example and sort of explain why culture is foundational to safety?
Sure. Well, I increasingly over the years, we've it's not at all controversial to suggest that culture is king. And what we talk about is the incredible power of peer pressure. So a simple example, from a utility company I worked with years ago, 2 weeks in their university to be a fully qualified engineer, So at 2 weeks, once they've qualified, they have to do 2 weeks to be qualified for the company. So it's quite an intensive training session. Yeah, and what we found is that you put them in the back of a van with 3 experienced guys, and they've gone native by lunchtime. Because, and lots of user-friendly examples that I won't use here because they're all about sport and other things. But what you find is no matter what your intentions, you tend to react to what you see around you. So a non-controversial one, you pick up a hire car at an airport and you warn, do not speed on our island, I don't know, Cyprus, Trinidad, because we'll nail you and ruin your holiday. And as you hit the motorway, you see a big sign that says 80 kilometers an hour maximum, severe penalties. You're definitely doing 78 kilometers an hour as you come out. But as you drive down the road, what you find is the inside lane is doing 90, the middle lane is doing 100, and it's a free for all in the outside lane. And we used to ask the question, well, what speed would you be doing 10 minutes later? But of course, delegates would say, well, you've got to keep up with flow, haven't you? It's not safe to not keep up with flow. So we found a better question was, how many of you would have used the outside lane within the first half an hour? And as a rule, half the audience put their hand up because you respond not to what it says on the tin or what you've been trained. You respond to what the experienced, confident people around you do, and you take your lead from them. And almost instantly at that, for that matter. So culture is king because, I was involved in Cullen 2, looking at Ladbroke Grove, the train crash, rather than Cullen 1, the Piper Alpha disaster. And when we came up with a definition, which was, your culture is what is typical or unremarkable on a normal day. So it's not what we say it is, it's what actually happens around us on a normal day. And that's your culture, and culture is king.
The last one is avoid using safety culture and safety climate interchangeably. You touched on this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, it's something that unfortunately still happens today, despite so many different articles and journals saying, do not do this. They are different concepts. As I said, the best way to think about it is that the culture is the sort of the overarching umbrella concept, which includes safety climate within it. Climate is probably more representing the middle layer. If we think about culture as a big onion, the middle section are the beliefs, the descriptive ethnographic approach. The middle layer is the climate, or the perception and the values and the priorities. And the outer layer is all the manifestations and tangible signs of what people do in the organization. So if we confuse the two, we're sort of not really being accurate in what we're saying.
And then we're just creating two confusing terms. Safety Labs is created by Slice, the only safety knife on the market with a finger-friendly blade. Find us at sliceproducts.com. Until next time, stay safe.